Since the early days, I always knew that standard bearers are the cream of the crop for DP generation. It's hard to be into this game and not eventually hear about the virtues of Myrtle. And anyone who has played with both standard bearers and pioneers can pretty quickly and intuitively understand the differences between them. But then, a couple years ago, agents became a thing in Arknights. Agents are pretty weird when it comes to DP generation. People were saying that they were good, but unlike flag bearers versus pioneers, it's a lot more difficult to intuitively grasp by playing. So at the time, I made myself a spreadsheet and some graphs to better visualize how agents compared to flag bearers and pioneers, because that's the sort of thing I do in my spare time. Now that Matsukiri is out, we have a new DP-related mechanic to think about. This video aims to show how DP generation compares between different Vanguard branches, and how Matsukiri fits into the current ecosystem. Before we actually get to them though, I thought it would be good to talk briefly about Vanguards in general. If you ask, what are Vanguards for? The usual response is that they are for making DP. And oftentimes, they are ranked, primarily or even entirely, on their ability to make DP. I don't think this is the right way to think about Vanguards. Vanguards should instead be thought of as operators that are usually more impactful when deployed early in the stage. Generating DP is naturally an important thing to get started early on, but different classes approach this problem differently. I'm going to be mostly talking about DP generation in this video, but I don't want this to be viewed as commentary on how good the different archetypes are. Rather, some operators are brought for DP generation, but others are brought for early game damage or utility. On a side note, I'll probably get some people who disagree with me putting chargers above tacticians on this list, but for this video that discussion is moot, since you're not bringing either for DP generation, and I won't be talking about them here. A couple more things before we talk about DP generation for real, just so I don't need to keep repeating things throughout the video. First, I'm going to assume that if you're here watching a slideshow about DP generation, your 4 stars and welfare units are probably at max potential, or they will be in the near future. For non-welfare 5-star and 6-star operators, I'm going to assume they're all at potential 1, because I hate gacha and gacha hates me. Also, I'm assuming operators are E2, skills are M3, and modules are built where relevant. Also, in my models, I only calculate the DP generated every second. This means that things that are supposed to happen instantaneously will look like they happen over the course of 1 second in my graphs. It doesn't really change any of the actual analysis, but I suspect it'll raise a couple eyebrows if I don't specifically mention it here. As an extension of this, since I'm treating an entire second as a single point of data, there's probably going to be some off by 1 errors in some of the graphs. I've tried my best to be consistent, but some of these calculations were done years ago, so there might be some discrepancies. Just assume that any of the graphs could be off by a little bit. It shouldn't be big enough to make any differences to the overall trends, though. Finally, with the introduction of Matsukiri, we have a new DP cost reduction mechanic. I talk about DP generation and DP cost reduction as separate things, but when I'm talking about them together, I'll usually refer to them as DP impact, just so I don't have to say so many words. Okay, let's get started. So when we talk about DP generation, on most stages we get 1 DP per second. Most stages will also have some initial DP, but this varies stage by stage, so I'm just going to assume in all these graphs that we start at 0 DP. This white line represents the total DP we have available over the course of a stage. By deploying a Vanguard, we sacrifice some of our DP in order to make use of the Vanguard now, and also to generate some DP in the future. In this example, we deploy Courier, and the available DP over the course of the fight changes to this red line. Looking at graphs with this base DP generation included is difficult though, so for the rest of the video I'm going to eliminate that base DP generation, so we can just look at the direct effects of the operator we're looking at, like this. You can see here that once we deploy Courier, our DP impact goes negative to represent the DP we spent to deploy him. And every time he uses his skill, the line goes back up. Here we see that Courier pays off his initial deployment cost on his second skill activation, around the 55-second mark. Now, I am a Male Knights player, and a lot of my discussion will be centered around male operators. But most people don't use Courier nowadays, so this graph is kind of contextless and difficult to compare with in-game experience. So for the first set of slides, I'm going to introduce some benchmarks. If I had to guess, the two Vanguards that people are most familiar with are probably Myrtle and Inez. So here's Myrtle and Inez. Myrtle, in purple, is easy to understand. You deploy her, you wait for her skill to become available, and then she prints DP over the course of a few seconds. Inez, in maroon, is shown using her S2, since that is, to my understanding, her general use skill. It's shown as a dashed line since her DP generation is a lot more theoretical. This line assumes she is constantly attacking during her S2, and is consistently stealing attack speed from her targets. I haven't built up my Inez, so I don't really have a good sense of how realistic this actually is. But I can't really build a model since available enemies are stage specific, so I'm just going to put this theoretical maximum as her benchmark. Okay, let's start with Pioneers. I've got Courier from before, as well as Chiave on his S1 in orange. If you use Texas, her S1 is identical to Chiave's, so her DP line is the same. I haven't included the 6 stars since typically operators like Siege and Saga are brought in more for their lane holding ability rather than DP generation. Having said that, someone is probably annoyed that I'm showing Chiave and Texas S1. Typically these operators aren't brought for their S1, but rather their S2 and the extra utility they bring. It's a fair point, so here's the same graph with an extra overlay of Chiave S2 and Texas S2. Overall, there isn't much difference in DP generation compared to their S1s. In reality though, you'll probably be waiting for a group of enemies before activating their S2s, rather than activating them as soon as they go off cooldown. So in a real scenario, DP generation will be a bit lower with their S2s. Looking at this chart as a whole, it's clear that Pioneers generate significantly less DP than Myrtle. Nothing groundbreaking here. As I said before, this is something that people talk about a lot, and is generally understandable intuitively through gameplay. There's also not too much to say about standard bearers and their S1s. Myrtle is considered the queen of the flag bearers because the point at which she pays off her initial cost is the earliest, somewhere around the 22-second mark. With that said, it's worth noting that out of all of the flag bearers, she produces significantly less than the rest when you look at the long-term picture. The rest of the flag bearers are generally tightly clustered and quickly overtake Myrtle's DP generation. Here's the profile for agents. The skills shown are Cantabile S2 in light blue, Chilchuck S1 in brown, Inez S2 in maroon, and Puzzle S1 in dark yellow. As I mentioned before, these lines are all very theoretical and are completely dependent on these operators having targets to hit. Assuming there are valid targets to hit though, they all have roughly the same DP curves, with DP generation in line with Myrtle. Since I am a Male Knights player, I feel like I'm obligated to go a little bit more into Chilchuck and Puzzle here. Chilchuck's S1 generates a random amount of DP on skill activation. However, while it is random, the possible outcomes are not evenly distributed. The actual calculation flips a 3-sided coin 3 times, with each flip having a chance to increase the DP generated, decrease the DP generated, or to do nothing. The coin is also weighted slightly towards increasing DP generation, so the final outcome of DP values is a normal distribution with a bit of a skew to the right. For this DP generation graph though, I'm ignoring all of that, and just assuming Chilchuck gets the average expected value of 7.48 DP each time. As for Puzzle, this graph assumes that he never procs his talent, since I don't have a way to model that. However, sometimes, if there's a stage mechanic with devices that can be attacked, Puzzle can trigger his talent consistently. It's something I abused in my recent clear of AS-S4. In a scenario like this, Puzzle's DP generation goes through the roof. In the case of this graph, I mean that somewhat literally. Okay, so now that we've looked at a bunch of operators and their DP generation graphs, where does Matsukiri land? Before that, we should talk about Matsukiri S1 versus S2. This chart shows the average DP generation per second and DP impact per second based on the number of supporter and defender operators you have in the deployment waiting zone. If we look at purely the DP that is generated by each skill, Matsukiri's S2, in solid yellow, actually generates more DP in the long run compared to S1, in solid green. However, once you start taking into account the DP cost reductions of the two skills, his S1 becomes more valuable in most cases. At first glance, as far as total DP impact goes, S2 begins to outpace S1 once you have 4 supporter and defender operators. Not only is this more than what you'd bring in a typical squad, but this chart is also a little misleading for a couple reasons. First, the cost reduction you get from S2 is dependent on the number of supporters and defenders in the deployment waiting zone, not your squad. In reality, if a third of your squad is defenders and supporters, some of them are going to get deployed relatively early, which decreases the efficiency of Matsukiri's S2. The other issue is a bit more subtle. Matsukiri's S1 reduces the cost of one operator by 4. This means that we can take advantage of this cost reduction in full relatively quickly by deploying that one operator. In comparison, if you're using S2 to reduce the cost of multiple operators, that means you can't immediately realize those cost reductions, since the value of the skill is spread out. This means that when we use S2, we spend much more time on the lower, real DP generated line of this graph. At this point, I want to make it clear that I'm not saying Matsukiri's S1 is better than his S2. His S1 only offers DP generation and cost reduction, and nothing else. S2, however, offers more in the form of buffs to himself and others. Perhaps the most impactful of these is his self-regen, which is pretty valuable on a Vanguard. Since you tend to deploy Vanguards early, they'll often start taking damage before you can get your medics out. Self-regen can help to delay the need for a medic, which can help relieve early game DP pressure. However, I'm mainly talking about DP generation today, so I'll be focusing a bit more on Matsukiri's S1. This has the added benefit of me not having to make a million DP curves for Matsukiri's S2, which is variable based on the number of supporters and defenders in your squad. For Matsukiri's DP graphs, I've split out his DP impact into a solid, real DP generation curve, and a theoretical DP generation plus cost reduction curve. I've separated them because, as I mentioned before, DP generation brings an immediate value, while the value of the cost reduction isn't actually realized until you deploy the affected operator. For the sake of visualizing what Matsukiri's S2's DP curve can look like, the yellow dashed line here uses a hypothetical scenario. This curve assumes you bring 2 defenders and 1 supporter on your squad, and that you deploy one of them between the first and second activation of Matsukiri's S2. Since this curve changes depending on your squad composition and how quickly you deploy your operators, from this point onwards, I'm only going to show the solid, real DP generation for Matsukiri's S2. Feel free to use your own imagination to fill in the additional benefit of cost reductions. Here's Matsukiri's performance versus a few selected 5 stars. I promise I'll make the graph a bit less messy soon, but even from here, the immediate first observation is that if we can't effectively utilize his DP cost reduction, his real DP generation alone is a bit worse than even the Pioneers. However, if we are able to take advantage of the cost reductions, his effective impact on DP falls just a bit behind Myrtle's. Let's clean up this graph a bit. I'm going to go a little deeper into how Matsukiri compares to each Vanguard branch, and talk a bit about non-DP related factors to consider. Also, at this point, I think Myrtle and Enos's benchmark lines have served their purpose, so I won't be including them from this point on. When it comes to choosing Matsukiri versus Kiave or Texas, the 2 questions to consider are whether you need any of the utility that Kiave or Texas's S2 provide, and how quickly you can take advantage of Matsukiri's cost reductions. Matsukiri, especially if he's on his S1, doesn't really provide a lot of utility. Mainly an attack buff to supporters and defenders, which in most cases isn't that impactful. So if you have a need for their S2s, Kiave and Texas still have value without sacrificing too much DP generation. But if you don't and only need DP, then Matsukiri will usually come out ahead. One other point I want to make here. Kiave and Texas both have modules that decrease their DP costs. This makes it a little unfair to compare their total value to Matsukiri, who doesn't have a module yet, even if we assume Matsukiri won't get a DP-related module in the future. So in the interest of showing the value of this module, here's an extra graph, showing what Matsukiri's curves would look like if he also had that same mod. We can see that a good chunk of the value of Kiave and Texas over Matsukiri's baseline DP generation is thanks to this module. So if you haven't built their modules yet, this makes them less useful as far as DP generation goes compared to Matsukiri. Of course, in reality, I don't expect strategists to get a module like this. If I had to theory craft a bit, I'd say the first strategist module would probably be something like, when retreated, refunds a certain amount of DP. Something like that would highlight the strategist's unique ability to provide buffs that persist after they are retreated. When comparing Matsukiri with standard bearers, it's clear that standard bearers are still the kings and queens of DP generation. Even if you can fully take advantage of Matsukiri's cost reductions, the total DP impact still falls a bit behind Myrtle. Even so, the curves are fairly close. Because enemies target your last deployed operator in most cases, you're incentivized to place your squishier ranged operators early and your tankier melee operators later. This results in something akin to a game of chicken. In an ideal scenario, you keep deploying ranged operators until their damage can't keep up with enemies, then deploy your tanky blockers at the last minute to stop their advance. Flag bearers exacerbate this since they have one block and stop blocking when they print DP. Although I show flag bearers here with solid lines, there's an argument that their initial DP generation is slightly theoretical, since their ability to activate their skill is dependent on them not being required for blocking enemies. But historically, the difference in DP generation between flag bearers and pioneers is great enough that people generally agree the benefits outweigh the costs. The addition of Matsukiri changes the balance of power here. Matsukiri's DP impact is still lower than the flag bearers, but it's close enough that I think there's a compelling argument to bring him by default and not have to worry so much about early enemies. Having a reliable 2-block unit deployed from the start reduces the pressure of needing to put down a melee blocker, which can give more time to put down valuable DPS units. If you're willing to give up a little bit more DP generation to use as S2, this also reduces the pressure of needing to put down a healer, which also gives more time to put down your DPS. Matsukiri's S1 also has the added value of being automatically activated, so you don't need to worry about paying attention to your flag bearers and accidentally missing a skill activation. It's also a nice sanity saver for modes with no DP generation, like Annihilation. As for agents, I debated not including this slide, but I think I'd get questions if I didn't. There isn't much value in making any comparisons here. The way they work is different enough that a one-to-one comparison seems a bit unfair. Agents bring a lot to the table, offering high potential DP generation, a larger range, and pseudo-fast redeploy timers. They also synergize with attack speed buffs, which can further elevate their DP generation. Meanwhile, Matsukiri offers 2-block and much more reliable DP generation, which isn't impacted by available attack targets or reduced by attack speed debuffs. It's also worth noting that, due to their fast redeploy nature, agents, especially Ines and Cantabile who usually use their S2s, are often retreated after their first skill ends, so everything beyond the 25-second mark in this chart is even more up in the air. Looking back at the sliding scale I brought up earlier in the video, if I think about the value that Matsukiri brings, I'd put him somewhere between Pioneers and Standard Bearers. While Strategists as a whole could potentially fall a bit further down this list, Matsukiri specifically has a talent that isn't going to be very useful for most players. As for how I'm going to use him personally, as I mentioned before, I think the quality of life of not having to worry about blocking early enemies or activating flag bearer skills is worth the reduction in DP generation, at least for general gameplay. My blind squad, which is the squad I usually bring if I know nothing about the stage I'm about to play, currently has Elysium as a Vanguard, and I'll probably be replacing him with Matsukiri once I've finished leveling his S1. I'll probably also swap out Mizuki for someone like Ethan, so that the first DP cost reduction goes onto logos. As for what you should do, I'm not a big fan of giving advice. I'd rather just give the info and let people make decisions for themselves. But in general, if you're relatively new to the game and resources are still scarce, stick with Myrtle. She's cheaper to raise because she's a 4-star, and she'll likely remain the queen of the Vanguards for a long time. Your resources are better spent building more impactful roles, namely DPSs. If you're someone who usually opens stages with Ines, Matsukiri probably isn't of much interest to you. They're very different creatures, and their playstyles are very distinct. And if you enjoy the dynamic gameplay of Ines or agents in general, Matsukiri will probably feel a bit boring. But if you're a veteran who has the resources to level up operators on a whim, consider whether or not you think the extra quality of life that Matsukiri brings, which is to say, good DP generation without having to worry about activating skills or leaking enemies, are worth the cost of raising a 5-star. If you're someone doing niche knights or advanced clears, well, you can figure out if Matsukiri is useful to you yourself. You shouldn't need me at this point. And of course, the general rule of building operators you like overrides all of this. That's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I have one other topic I wanted to do in this kind of format, but for the most part, don't expect me to make more videos like this. It really isn't my style. Alright, I'm leaving now. I need to go find some water.